Okay, it's been a little over a couple of weeks since the last time I got an opportunity to do one of these. And hopefully my voice holds up through the whole entire thing. I've had something going on with it the past couple of days. But I know the last time I had talked about beware of the AA academics. And I almost want to title this one Beware the AA Historians, but I've got a different title in mind based on the subject matter. But what I was thinking about is when I first got introduced to AA, and for a number of years in AA, I would occasionally people would talk about the Oxford group, or people would talk about, where it all got started and how it all got started. And it didn't take me until long after I'd gotten out of AA, or at least until I had discovered the Armitage papers and started looking into the history of it, to find out that most of what I was told naturally was patently false. And the reason that the topic got brought up, or this topic got brought up, I mentioned last week I had been watching one of my favorite series in reruns. It was The Americans, about KGB agents living in the United States in the 1980s. And it kind of ran out of steam after the third season. The first two seasons were really intense, but there is a part in the show where one of the main characters starts going to this organization called EST. And that rang a bell in the back of my mind for some reason. There's a couple of references to the 1980s, the early 1980s, within the series itself but that rang a bell, and I couldn't remember exactly where I had heard it. And the best thing I could remember was it was one of those things, if you grew up back then, you know what I'm talking about, when you were homesick from school one day and the television was turned on Donahue, and you see something like that happening. It seemed like that's where I remember hearing it. But it piqued my curiosity enough that I decided to look into it. And this is going to tie into the Oxford group later, as I'm going to demonstrate. If my voice stays with us the whole time. But in the series itself, it's a little bit misrepresented what EST is. It sort of looks like, kind of like these new age self-help groups that you just drop into and you listen to a lecture and, people get up and talk and all this other stuff. And that's not exactly what EST was really like. EST started in the early 1970s. It came out of something called the human growth movement or human potential movement, one of these new agey cult type things. But you didn't actually go to like EST meetings, and you didn't actually go to an EST gathering. It was more like seminars, and they lasted for entire weekends. They would start at like 9 o'clock in the morning, and they didn't end until midnight or 4 o'clock in the morning the next day. You weren't allowed to get up and go to the bathroom. You weren't allowed to talk to the person next to you. You weren't allowed to take notes. And you were subjected to a whole series of lectures in which you were told that everything in life that you had ever had happen to you bad was all your fault. There is a book on it. I looked it up online and read a couple of chapters about it. You were berated. You were called an asshole. You were called a fearful lowlife. You were called all these names, and then you were given all these weird meditations and weird lectures and things like that in order to accomplish whatever it was that they were trying to accomplish. Ultimately, you got it, is what more or less what they would say at the end of those things after you went through the whole entire thing and survived. But I noticed that it operated from the early 1970s till the mid 1980s, and then a lot of public backlash started happening to it, and the guy who started the thing was notorious for suing people. Like if you wrote a negative article about him as a journalist, he would sue you. If there was any allegations made against him, he would sue you. He would just sue everybody like mad. He left the country finally with a whole bunch of. He was facing a whole bunch of penalties for tax evasion and fraud, and of course he sued all the people involved in that. And he was always managing to sue and win, which makes me wonder what kind of creepy connections he had. But simply what happened when the public kind of fell out of favor with it, they just changed their name to something else. They turned it into something called the Forum. It was the same thing, but it was the same kind of cult mentality, and it was the same kind of weird lectures and all that other kind of stuff. It just had changed the name. And then it lasted for a long time before, whatever reasons, it changed its name again. And it's still around today. It's called Landmark. I've never had any experience with that. I don't know anybody who has, but it's still in survival today. And it's probably still doing those same kinds of weird cult-like tactics. Well, when I got to AA, I know the official party line story that was told to me by, one in meetings or by sponsors or by whomever was, your Oxford group was around for a little while, and Bill and Bob took the idea of AA from the Oxford group and started AA, and it's actually a little bit more complex than that, and it's actually a lot of crap considering how it really goes down. I know if you have ever seen that movie, My Name is Bill W., they made me watch that when I was in treatment one time. It looks like that, Bill and Bob just meet and they just start AA, and that's not at all how it happened in history. I've got a lot of well-documented proof of this in the Armitage papers, but of course the AA people tried to say that the Oxford group was concerned with healing society or some shit like that, and Bill and Bob had a higher calling. They were out to save alcoholics, which is actually blatantly false. When Bill and Bob first started, they were recruiting for the Oxford group. They weren't creating an Alcoholics Anonymous at that time. It remains somewhat shrouded in mystery to this day whether Bill was asked to leave the Oxford group or whether Bill, through his own grandiosity, chose to leave on his own. Because the Oxford group liked to rub shoulders with the wealthy. It liked to rub shoulders with the rich and famous, and it loved its donations rolling in. It preached a very similar doctrine to AA. It preached that you were powerless and that you needed to surrender to God and you needed a higher power and all that other stuff. Pretty much the bare bones essentials of what became AA. They just enhanced it a little bit more, made 12 steps out of it, but it was more or less the same old bullshit. But the way it was explained to me for a lot of years is the Oxford group just sort of faded out because they didn't have a higher purpose. Yeah, that was literally how it was explained to me by AA old-timers, that, Bill and Bob had such a more noble calling. God wanted to save alcoholics. He didn't give a fuck about the rest of the world, I don't guess. But the history of that is not exactly true when you go to digging around into it. What happened with the Oxford group, who happens to still be around today, and they kind of keep it on the hush-hush when you look into it. Like when I Googled the Oxford group today, it's surprisingly little information. You have to kind of know where to dig in order to find it. But what happened literally with the Oxford group is around the time the world looked like it was falling into, like it was headed into a Second World War, Frank Buckman just found a new thing to sell. It was moral rearmament, he called it. Although, if you go to the Wikipedia page, it sounds like it was some kind of organization that was against war and promoted peace and all that other stuff. It's totally blatantly false. Frank Buckman actually blamed the problem with the World War thing that was kicking off. He blamed it on the United States itself. He blamed it on our selfishness and self-centeredness is what those are his exact words to describe the United States and the free world at the time. Didn't seem to have much of a problem with the other side because, they were standing against the hordes of communism. But there was certainly nothing peaceful about moral rearmament. And to dispel another lie I was told in AA, about Frank Buckman. I remember one old asshole sponsor of mine used to say that Frank Buckman came up with the idea that you could communicate directly to God and you didn't need a middleman, unlike those churches and those religious people. No, Frank Buckman may have said you didn't need a middleman because he was going to be the new middleman, right? It always amazed me how many people in AA were always so quick to kind of bash anything to do with the religion in general, failing to see that they were just as guilty of, if not far worse, than any of religious fanaticism. I would see AA members talk about how they didn't need to go to church because of church people need to get saved and all that. And I was like, what the fuck do you think you're doing when you come to AA meetings every night? When you have to come here and read the same things over and over again like a ritual? When you're told how to pray, what to pray for, whom to pray to, really. I mean, they'll say you can believe in whatever God or higher power you want to, but obviously your God or higher power has to be all 4 to 12 steps and surrendering and turning over your will in your life and not having any independent thought and not being able to take credit for anything. And your ego is a nasty word that you can never really use in conjunction with anything positive. But it's a spiritual, not religious organization. But as far as Frank Buckman talking about direct lines to God, well, he wasn't exactly this guy, this hippie that was going around telling everybody, you can communicate with the universe at large here. I mean, not at all. In fact, when he started moral rearmament, his whole idea of moral rearmament wasn't about world peace. It was about creating a worldwide dictatorship under God control, he called it. One of his quotes here, for example, it says, "The true patriot gives his life to bring his nation under God's control. Those who oppose God control are public enemies of world peace. World peace will only happen when all nations have achieved God control." Now, what does he mean by God control? I mean, obviously, he claimed, even Buckman tried to play that spiritual angle from time to time in the early Oxford group. But when you're talking about God control, exactly whose God are we talking about here, and which doctrine is it we're supposed to be following? I mean, you said worldwide God control. Doesn't really sound like a guy that's telling you can find whatever higher power you want, does it? He also wrote, "The country must be governed by men under instructions from God." Oh, I got to say that again. Men under instructions from God. Let me guess, men like him, or him especially, as definitely given and understood if they can achieve this dictatorship of the living God. Dictatorship of the living God. And the answer to all of it, this is true patriotism. This is true patriotism. True patriotism. So true patriotism is trying to achieve God-controlled dictatorship with a few men obeying the will of God and telling everybody else what to do. Gotcha. Makes perfect sense. He goes on to later say that when you and I are not 100% God-guided and God-controlled, we're really helping chaos. In other words, we're either like Frank Buckman or we're chaos. A false dichotomy if I ever heard one. All lukewarm people are really helping chaos. All lukewarm people are helping chaos. In other words, you're either fanatic like me or you're chaos. The fate of nation depends on whether you and I and the rest of the nation are God-controlled. See, there he goes with that God-controlled again. What is with this dictatorship of God-controlled obsession shit that he has? Is he putting himself at the forefront of it all, I'm sure. It's no wonder a lot of religious organizations around this time started to kind of turn their back on the Oxford group. The Oxford group originally said you could belong to whatever denomination you wanted. Granted, you put them first, of course, just like AA says you can believe whatever you want to believe so long as you put AA and the cult first. But it's no wonder that some of the church leaders and some of the other people around at the time started kind of saying, hey, something, this guy's a fucking lunatic. Because he went on to say the next step was for men and women in every nation to enlist in the moral rearmament. He didn't change the name of the Oxford group at this time. But what happened was the war was coming along and he needed a new angle for a new sales pitch. And so he had a new sales pitch. He was playing everybody's hysteria and fever, making them believe that, the whole entire world needed to be under some kind of God-controlled dictatorship in order to be saved. There was only a few problems with this. One, he had a tendency, and I do have some documented proof of that, he had a tendency to blame the free world for the problems and not the enemies that were actually at the heart of the war. He actually took sides with the enemies on some occasions, praised the enemies on some occasions because those enemies could be brought under God control. And he further went on and urged people to dodge the draft and a whole lot of other things. As a matter of fact, if you go to their Wikipedia page about the Oxford group, it's blatantly propaganda written. It doesn't even have any basis in fact whatsoever. What happened with moral rearmament was after the war had ended, after World War II was over with, it wasn't popular. I mean, at all. When he first started out, he was going to prevent World War, and of course he didn't do that. And then, of course, when the World War happened, he kind of believed that we shouldn't even take no part in that. We just needed to be concerned in ourselves with surrendering to God control. And then once the war was over with, he was trying to rebrand his image once again, and it didn't quite ever get the it didn't quite ever get any kind of traction like it tried to gain during the war effort. During war hysteria, you can get all kinds of frenzied masses to engage in any kind of psychotic beliefs or whatever that go along with the hysteria of the time. I mean, we really didn't know what the end result of the World War was going to be, which would have led to a lot of fear and uncertainty, and then not to mention the economic chaos that was going on at the time. So moral rearmament continued, believe it or not. They tried a new tactic in the 1950s. They tried doing anti-labor unions, and they tried, he hated, Buckman proclaimed to hate materialism, which is really funny. Isn't it funny these wealthy cult leaders always pretend to hate materialism? It's just like these AA people that say material things don't matter to them, and yet they're the first one to steal money out of your wallet or out of the basket when they get an opportunity. Always funny about that kind of thing. But did they fade out into obscurity? They're still around today. They're just not called moral rearmament anymore. You have to dig far and wide to find them. They're called the Initiative of Change, and I actually found their webpage. And they openly admit that they have been active for over 80 years. They grew out of the work of Frank Buckman, an American Lutheran minister. They failed to go into the history of what happened with him on that. And that Buckman affirmed there's divine purpose for the world and everyone in it, and demonstrated the connection between faith and change in society. This is from their webpage. Over the years, his work expanded to include people of different religions and no religions at all. In the 20s, his work became known as the Oxford Group and was renamed Moral Rearmament. It changed its name again in 2001. Okay. And then the funny thing about this organization today, you would have to do a lot of reading and a lot of digging to really get to the heart of the matter, but they're very vague about what it is they're supposed to be doing. They're supposedly claiming they're making the world a better place, but they have nothing on their webpage that says exactly how. It just says they're in 60 different countries all over the world, and that you have to start with the change in yourself. And they kind of, I guess they've toned down on the powerlessness and the God dictatorship and all that other kind of crap that they were preaching a long time ago, because now they just kind of want to sound like we're all about world peace and helping people. The only problem is they don't say exactly what it is they do. They don't have any any platform as to how they're going to make the world a better place. They don't have any platform about what they support. They really don't have much of anything. They're just kind of just this weird web page of people that are saying that they're making positive change and bringing positive change into the world. It is kind of funny how these cults have to keep changing their names and have to keep hiding and keep obscuring their original purposes. Like, you have to dig all through the page to find out anything about Frank Buckman. I mean, if you go to Initiatives of Change, it doesn't say right at the front, who they are. It just gives you this feel-good advertisement in these bright, warm green colors about how the world can be a better place and the change starts within you. It's kind of like with the EST meetings, they told you it was about taking personal responsibility for yourself. They just didn't tell you that it also included believing everything was all your fault, kind of like AA does, and that anything bad that ever happened to you, you somehow played a part in, kind of like AA does. You see, the problem with religious cults in general, including Alcoholics Anonymous, is they'll take a slight grain of something that sounds good on the surface, sounds kind of good on the surface, but when you begin to examine it really closely under a microscope, it all begins to fall apart. It's one of those things that's why I think people fall and buy into it. Now, partially, AA gets people now because of the court system and the treatment system and the multi-billion-dollar-a-year rehab industry that forces people into the program. But AA also, a large majority of its appeal, it gets you when you're desperate. It gets you when you're afraid, when your confidence is shaken in yourself, when you're not at your strongest will and you're susceptible to believe pretty much anything. And I don't mean by believe anything, I mean you're just desperate for answers, and they fill you full of this false hope that they have an answer, and by the time that you realize it's all a bunch of bullshit, it's too late, or at least by the time that, like in my case, when I first started questioning the efficiency of AA or whether or not it worked, There was a part of my mind that just went into a panic. Well, if this can't save me, then nothing can save me because there's nothing else out there. And that's another thing to always be suspicious of when it comes to any kind of organization that promotes so-called help or so-called change is if they have to crush your spirit, or if they have to crush your individualism, or if they have to tell you that you're inherently bad as a person and need to be rebuilt in some kind of way, then you can pretty much guarantee, you've wandered over into the territory of a cult. You ever notice that in AA they say your higher power can be whatever you want it to be, but have you ever heard anybody go to an AA meeting and say, my higher power told me that a healthy dose of ego is a good thing for me today, or my higher power told me self-confidence is key and overcoming negative self-talk is something I need to work on? Have you ever heard anybody say that in a meeting? No, you won't hear them say that in a meeting. What you hear in a meeting is reinforced powerlessness, reinforced disease, reinforced dependency. You need the group, you need the 4-step, you need sponsors, you need meetings. And most of all, you can't think independently on your own, and you can't be independent on your own. But anyway, at 21 minutes, I just thought I'd let you guys know, yeah, the Oxford group's still out there. And no, the Oxford group did not fade away because it didn't have a higher spiritual purpose. It faded away because it threw all of its weight behind an unpopular cause during a world war and fell out of favor with most of the country. And Buckman's megalomania also helped contribute to ruining it. But anyway, hopefully I'll get the chance to get another video out to you guys pretty soon, and maybe by then my voice will have been healed a little bit and I don't sound like Vito Corleone. Till next time.